Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. Once again, I'm your host, David Thompson. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Glenn LaFantasie, who is the Richard Frockt Family Professor of Civil War History at Western Kentucky University. And today, we are going to be talking about Dr. LaFantasie's recent article in the fall issue of the Civil War Monitor entitled Broken Promise, in which he examines the legacy of Robert E. Lee and perhaps how he fell a bit short of his idol, George Washington. So, Dr. LaFantasie, thank you so much for joining us today.
David, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Now, I wondered if you could perhaps start us off by discussing kind of some of these origins, these roots of where the parallels between Washington and Lee even come from.
Well, long before the Civil War, Lee and the Lee family had a relationship of sorts with Washington, if only through, but it's a significant only, Robert E. Lee's father, Light Horse Harry Lee, who was a Revolutionary War cavalryman, led Lee's Legion, as it was called, a cavalry partisan group, and was much admired by George Washington, and the feeling was mutual on the part of Light Horse Harry Lee. So stories of the Revolution came down through the family, and Robert E. Lee, as Light Horse Harry's son, certainly heard a lot of those stories and was fairly ingrained with the idea that Washington was a man of the utmost quality and was someone that should be respected and admired. So that's where the relationship between Lee and Washington really starts. But it builds in the Civil War by 1862, when Lee takes command of what he will name the Army of Northern Virginia during the Peninsula Campaign. And it was shortly after some of the major victories that Lee won during that campaign, pushing George B. McClellan's Union Army of the Potomac back to the James River and saving Richmond from capture, that newspaper articles and others began to talk about Lee as the Confederate Washington. And that linkage was readily in the minds of Southerners and Confederates. The official Confederate seal had an image of the equestrian statue of George Washington that still stands outside the Virginia state capitol. And Confederates saw themselves, many Confederates did at least, saw themselves as the true inheritors of revolutionary heritage. And there's no greater hero of the Revolutionary War, and then through the era of so-called Federalist era, when George Washington became president, here was a son of Virginia who had won the Revolutionary War and then became first president of the United States. Southerners thinking and claiming that Washington was their own. And so when it came to Lee and the beginning of his winning what would amount to a string of victories against Union armies in the East, or the Army of the Potomac in the East, that association was readily made in the minds of Southerners.
Now, building off of this, though, it's curious, as you point out, Lee's father is a Revolutionary War hero. A lot of sons look up to their fathers, but in Lee's mind, it certainly seems, and you seem to make the case, that Washington trumps Light Horse, in this instance. And I wondered, can you flesh out some of the origins of that? Is there a sense why, beyond the fact of just Washington's, I guess you could say, star power?
Yeah, there seem to have been some very real and deep issues that contributed to Lee's affinity for Washington rather than for his own father. For one thing, Light Horse Harry Lee, great hero of the Revolutionary War, became governor of Virginia, was a noted Federalist who was quite close in his political thinking to George Washington. But Light Horse Harry, unfortunately, had an ability to squander the family fortunes, and ultimately he did just that. Plus, he was away from home for much of Robert E. Lee's childhood. So he had Robert E. Lee had an absentee father of sorts. What was Light Horse Harry doing away from home? Well, part of it was the squandering of his fortune. He's very interested in acquiring land, but he had a particular proclivity for getting involved in land deals that went south, as they say, fairly quickly. Light Horse Harry Lee didn't even die in Virginia and was not originally buried in Virginia. He died on Cumberland Island, an island off the coast of Georgia, where Catherine Greene, the widow of another revolutionary hero, Nathaniel Greene, had a plantation there on Cumberland Island, and Light Horse Harry had been visiting her at the time that he died. No hanky-panky implied there, but it just happens he was there visiting Catherine and Catherine Greene, and he died and was buried there. Robert E. Lee would, after the Civil War, reinter Light Horse Harry and bury him in the family tomb that had been constructed around or inside Lee's chapel, so-called, at then Washington College, now Washington and Lee University.
Now, you have a pretty powerful line here in your article in which you flatly say, Lee lacked Washington's greatness. Care to elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure.
It's one of those lines when you're reading a piece that kind of makes you stop in your tracks and think, which I think is a good thing. But I wondered if for our viewers here, you could just flesh that out a bit more.
Well, it's as many historical arguments are. It's complex, but I think the basis for it is that when it came to emulating Washington, which Robert E. Lee absolutely did, people around him noticed the similar qualities between George Washington and Robert E. Lee. Governor Henry Wise of Virginia once said to Robert E. Lee that he did a fine job in impersonating George Washington. I'm not sure it was meant as a compliment, in fact, but nevertheless, a lot of people saw the resemblance. But Lee himself particularly modeled his own demeanor and behavior, his stoicism, his ability to remain withdrawn, even though he's fully engaged in event like the Civil War and leading the Army of Northern Virginia. So Robert E. Lee modeled his behavior on Washington, except when it came to the secession crisis in the winter of 1861 to 1860 to 1861. What happened then was Lee gets caught up in the turmoil of the time, in which he makes various and contradictory statements, mostly in letters to his children at the time, saying that disunion is not a legal remedy under the United States Constitution, that the union itself should be perpetual, and he outright states that secession would be treason if ever done by the southern states. Those are very direct remarks to his children. But when the secession issue comes to Lee's own doorstep, and that's the doorstep of Arlington Mansion on the hill overlooking Washington, D.C., because Lee had married the great granddaughter of Martha Custis, and this was Mary Custis, whom Lee had married. Mary Custis had inherited the Arlington mansion that had once belonged to George Washington, and that was Robert E. Lee's residence and Mary Lee's residence. So here he is in a mansion that once belonged to to George Washington. Sorry, and so the secession crisis comes to his doorstep in the sense that Virginia in early April 1861 had not seceded as yet. But once the firing takes place on Fort Sumter surrenders on April 14th, 1861, and Lincoln calls for the raising of 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. It's at that moment that Virginia decides to secede from the Union in a reaction to Lincoln's call for troops. Going on at the same time is the fact that Lincoln, through General Winfield Scott, who was then the General-in-Chief of the United States Army, Lincoln wanted Scott to ask Robert E. Lee to actually take command of the Union forces. And there were some go-betweens and conversations about this through the auspices of Francis Preston Blair, Sr., who was a politico from both Maryland and Missouri. Lee's answer to this invitation was to turn it down. And he did so by telling Winfield Scott that he could not raise his sword against his native Virginia. So he went home to Arlington. Then Virginia seceded, and Washington had to ponder for himself whether or not he should resign his commission. He was then a lieutenant colonel. He was a full colonel, having been promoted 2 weeks earlier than the time we're talking about. He had accepted that commission as colonel, but then 2 weeks later, with the secession crisis, he then decides he will resign his commission from the U.S. Army, and he will go with the state of Virginia. That's a very long lead up to the answer to your question, which is when push came to shove for Robert E. Lee, he disowned his loyalty to the United States and put his future into the hands of the Confederate States of America. From Lincoln's point of view, these 11 states that ultimately made up the Confederacy were states in rebellion against the United States. So Lee becomes a rebel and one who turned his back on a country that had paid for his education. Life in the U.S. Army was the only occupation that Robert E. Lee had ever had. But more significantly, Lee had taken a solemn oath to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies of the United States, domestic and foreign. And he broke that pledge, that oath that he swore under God, because those words are included and are still included, in fact, in the federal oath of office. And Lee turned his back on the Union, to which he had previously said that he was committed to. But when Virginia went out, he went out. After the Civil War, Lee fairly lamely justifies his action by comparing it to George Washington, who became a rebel against Great Britain and led his army to victory. He was not so fortunate as Washington, because, of course, his army of Northern Virginia was forced to surrender it at Appomattox in April 1865. Washington was able to be hailed as a hero for the victory he won at Yorktown. and for all intents and purposes, ending the Revolutionary War. But Lee tried to say that he and Washington were in similar circumstances when they decided to go with a rebellion against the existing authority of the time. But it's a stretch to actually make that argument because the circumstances were very different between Washington's decision and Lee's decision. They're two very different things. They ended up with different outcomes. Washington won, Lee lost. And it's a very frail argument to make. Then Lee piled on top of that a further justification. And this, by the way, he includes all of this justification for his own actions in a preface, an introduction to an edition that he published of his father's memoirs. So he seems to have come back to terms with his father in the post-war era, the 5 years left in Robert E. Lee's life after the Civil War. And in that introduction, he has this further justification that his father would have sided with the Confederacy, that his father approved of the notion of secession and the possibility, the legality, in other words, of secession. Well, that was absolutely wrong. And whether Robert E. Lee knew that it was wrong or not cannot be proven, and I certainly can't prove it. But the fact of the matter is that Light Horse Harry Lee spent his entire political career as a Federalist, as a supporter of George Washington. It would be Light Horse Harry Lee who would later write the famous phrase of Washington being first in the minds of his countrymen. And Light Horse Harry also has explicit statements on the record in various places, his correspondence and his record as governor of Virginia, stating that the federal union was perpetual. He took a hard stand against the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798, which had been authored by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Light Horse Harry was consistent throughout his political career and for the rest of his life in believing that the Union really should be perpetual. So Robert E. Lee's argument that he and Washington, there was no difference between their actions, and that in fact his own father would have approved of Robert's decision to go with the Confederacy, is just simply false. It's the way that he did justify himself, but those justifications were extremely weak and factually wrong, actually. So Lee saw, I think, a problem in his own actions. I think he was self-conscious about the fact. He saw that it was necessary to justify his own actions in this introduction he writes to his father's memoirs. And that in and of itself tells us something about Lee that never was found in Washington or in Washington's conscience, so far as we know. And that is that Lee had to explain himself, had to explain away why he turned his back on the United States of America and why he took up arms against it. And not only took up arms, but of course led an army that whose battles ended up with huge numbers of casualties and dead and wounded on both sides. So the taking up of arms was serious. It resulted in battles between the Army of Northern Virginia and particularly the Army of the Potomac. So this was serious stuff. I think Lee was self-conscious, and the idea of Lee not being as great as Washington is that Washington never really had to explain his actions. People accepted him as a hero, never questioned his loyalty first to the Patriot cause, then after the Declaration of Independence, his loyalty to the United States, then they were able to acclaim him as a great hero. He was asked, although he was reluctant to serve, he was asked to be president of the Constitutional Convention. He did finally agree to do that, and thus afterwards became the first president to be elected unanimously, at least in terms of the electoral vote, the nation's first president, and the only president to have been elected unanimously for at least one of his terms. This was a record of devotion to country, loyalty to country, that Lee just simply couldn't replicate. It was not. It had not been a part of his life because of his decision to go with the Confederacy. Instead of taking the decision as other Virginians did, like George Thomas. He was a Virginian. Winfield Scott himself was a Virginian. Neither of those two examples ever even thought about joining the Confederacy and leaving the Union behind. For them, being Virginians, they abided by their oath of allegiance to the United States. So that's why I did state very simply and very directly that Lee, in the end, really couldn't measure up to Washington's greatness. Now, that's not to say that Lee has not become perceived as great ever since his death in 1870, or well before, as he first gained his reputation as a warrior in 1862. Lee is probably among all historical figures, and this is a guess, but I think he's probably America's most beloved general and military figure, even more so than Washington. And despite the fact that Lee actually lost the war that he fought, but he does have an admirable side to him, and his soldiers loved him, and he loved them back. But still, in the end, there's that lack of a core of greatness that seems woefully missing from Robert E. Lee, that was instantaneously apparent in George Washington from the moment he accepted the Continental Congress's offer to command the Continental Army. From that moment on, there's just no question that George Washington and the fate of the United States go together as one.
Now, just to shift gears here a little bit with one final question for you, it's the new project that you're working on, moving away from Lee here a little bit, although Lee is certainly a factor in this, and the new project deals with Grant and Abraham Lincoln. So what is the new project? What are you looking at?
Well, I'm looking at the working and personal relationships between Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, and taking a very hard and close look at the relationships between those two men. This has been discussed before. It's been covered before. John Y. Simon had a very influential article on the relationship between Grant and Lincoln. Brooks Simpson has written eloquently on the subject of Lincoln and Grant. But as I began to look into the possibilities of this project, which were actually several years ago, I found that the way in which the Lincoln-Grant relationship had been described by previous historians tended not to go far enough, in the sense that most historians had come to an agreement that the working relationship between these two leaders of the Union took a while for this to really forge together and to put them, as we would say in our time, on the same page. But then ultimately, in a relatively short period of time, especially after Ulysses S. Grant was appointed General in Chief of the Union Armies and Lieutenant General of the United States Armies, a rank, by the way, that no one had held since George Washington. Then the relationship, so say historians and biographers, became very close, a close working relationship that led to the winning of the war. What I found was that it was more problematical than that, and it was far more complex than that. There was a great deal of suspicion on the part of both men, one to the other. Lincoln was suspicious of Grant, and given some of Grant's actions, such as at Shiloh, more so than probably any other battle. But Lincoln had heard the stories of Grant's drinking, but Lincoln worried more about the fact of whether or not Grant would become another McClellan. Of course, in Lincoln's mind, McClellan was such a traumatic event for the president, having to deal with this very odd general who didn't seem to want to fight the enemy, that I'm sure Lincoln, in the back of his mind, kept that worry real, especially as he went through a string of commanders for the Army of the Potomac. And even when General George Gordon Meade took over the Army just before Gettysburg, in the wake of Gettysburg, Lincoln was still suspicious of Meade. So he too would become suspicious of Grant as a possible McClellan who might not move fast enough, who might not be able to win victories. Lincoln was also suspicious of Grant because Grant, since Vicksburg, had gained great popularity in the North, because here now was a man who won victories, a general who won victories. And Lincoln worried that Grant might become so popular that he would become a rival for the presidency, that Grant might have political aspirations. That turned out not to be true, which allowed Lincoln and Grant to work more comfortably together. But those were Lincoln's suspicions. For Grant's suspicions of Lincoln, the first thing that Grant thought about was McClellan again, because from Grant's point of view, he worried that Lincoln would be constantly looking over his shoulder and interfering in military matters. And Grant, unlike many scholars today, admire Lincoln's abilities of learning on the job and learning military science and all those things. Grant had no such high admiration for the commander-in-chief at the moment of the war, when Grant was elevated to general-in-chief of the armies. I not only look at that period, though, from March 1864, with the promotion of Grant till the end of the war and Lincoln's assassination in April 1865. I actually begin their stories in 1861 because once the Western Theater opens up and battles begin to be fought there, Lincoln is reading the telegrams coming from that theater, and he's seeing the name of Grant repeated over and over again. And certainly Grant was well aware of Lincoln having come from Illinois, which is where Grant was living when the Civil War broke out. And so not a relationship per se, but at least these two men knew of one another, and both of them were cautiously watching the other. Lincoln trying to follow Grant's career, getting a little concerned about these drinking stories and not making the statement that's often attributed to him that someone should find out what Grant's brand of whiskey was so that he could send a barrel to every general. That's a fable. But nevertheless, Lincoln watching, scrutinizing Grant as well, being very sensitive to how Lincoln was constantly in the telegraph office, and constantly interfering. This was something that happened not only between Lincoln and McClellan. As I've gone through the official records and also the telegram records in the National Archives, I see Lincoln interfering all over the place, practically with every commanding general. Lincoln always has something to say, and a lot of the times it's disapproving. So Grant was walking a bit on eggshells by the time he gained his fame at Vicksburg, and then went on to Chattanooga, winning another victory. Ultimately, in the following spring, he would be promoted. But their relationship was no sure thing, and it didn't come together as readily as I think previous biographers have suggested. So that's what I'll be looking at. That's what the book will be primarily about. And I'm starting fresh. I'm just working as much as possible with primary sources, and of course, I have to deal with the secondary sources. But I'm writing the first draft of the book entirely based on primary sources, really trying to get at the heart of this relationship that would end up winning the Civil War.
Well, it sounds good, Dr. LaFantasie. I
Thank
look
you.
forward to perhaps having you on again to chat about the book when it does come out. Thank you so much for taking a bit of time today to speak with us again. The article is Broken Promise, everyone. It's in the latest issue of the Civil War Monitor, so the fall 2014 issue. If you haven't picked up the issue, I suggest you do. And while you're at it, you might as well get a subscription. There's the shameless plug right there. But thank you so much, Dr. LaFantasie, and we will be in touch.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.